Welcome to the Making Sense podcast. This is Sam Harris. Today I'm speaking with David French. David is a senior editor at The Dispatch and a contributing writer for The Atlantic. He is a graduate of Harvard Law School, and he was previously a senior writer for National Review and a columnist for Time magazine. He is a former constitutional litigator and past president of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. He's also a New York Times bestselling author. And his most recent book is Divided We Fall, America's Secession Threat and How to Restore Our Nation. David is also a former major in the United States Army Reserve and a veteran of Operation Iraqi Freedom, where he was awarded the Bronze Star. And in this conversation, we talk about all of the forces that are pulling American society apart. We discuss David's experience as a JAG officer in Iraq and his experience of being harassed to really an extraordinary degree by the far right for coming out against Trump. We talk about the way that real grievances drive political derangement, the illiberalism on both the left and the right, the role of prophecy in evangelical support for Trump, honor culture, the response to Hunter Biden's laptop, the January 6th hearings, the personality cult of Trumpism, federalism, geographic sorting, school polarization, cultural divisions in sports and entertainment, the gun rights movement, the ethics of gun ownership, whether Trump will be prosecuted, the looming 2024 presidential campaign, the dangers of online activism, and other topics. Anyway, it was great to finally get David here. I've been an admirer of his work for a long time, even though I know there are many topics on which we disagree. He is, after all, a religious conservative, but that made his perspective on the issues we did discuss all the more valuable. And now I bring you David French. I am here with David French. David, thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm honored.
Yeah, me too. I've long been an admirer of your short-form writing. I haven't. Your last book is the first book of yours I've read in anticipation of the podcast, which we'll talk about. But yeah, it's great to finally speak with you because your political commentary has been more than edifying. These many years where everything seems to have gone toward the brink and in many cases into the abyss.
Yeah, it's. I did not have this level of extremism. If you talked to me 20 years ago, I would not have seen this level of extremism, but it started emerging pretty soon after that, and now here we are.
Yeah. Well, so let's catch people up on your background here before we get started. Your most recent book, which came out in 2020, is Divided We Fall, which talks about the problem of American division that we're going to get into, and you focus on the prospect of secession, the actual secession, the actual fragmentation of the political union of the United States. And we'll talk about that as well. I mean, that, on its face, that has always seemed like a highly implausible threat, and yet you make it sound all too plausible when you get into the details in the book. And I can only imagine, since the book came out nearly 2 years ago, it came out right before the 2020 election, I assume things have only gotten worse in the meantime. Is that right, or how do you view the last 18 plus months since you published the book?
Yeah, I would say that things have accelerated in worse. They've accelerated more than I thought they would. I was pessimistic that I did not see, for example, January 6th occurring when I wrote the book. I did not see, for example, things like the Texas GOP, one of the largest and most influential wings of the Republican Party in the United States, calling for a secession referendum in Texas. Now, doubtful it will happen anytime soon, but this kind of conversation and this level of polarization is absolutely something that's accelerated. And when I wrote the book, I was nervous about using the word secession. I was nervous about introducing the concept. But what I saw was that we didn't have, and this is something I have to say right up front, that there is no single truly important cultural, political, religious, social trend that is pulling us together more than it's pushing us apart. And it's not just politics. It's where we live. It's how we live. It's our pop culture. It's so many different fronts that are sort of pushing us apart.
Yeah, I mean, so I must admit, I had a knee-jerk reaction to the concept of secession as just being a bridge or several bridges too far, and it sounds so implausible. But when I actually look at the assumptions that are anchoring that reaction, it's just there's so many assumptions like these that have been destroyed in recent years. I mean, I never would have imagined. The truth is, I still can't imagine that Trump was ever president of the United States. I mean,
True.
it's like I feel like I keep waking up in some alternate universe where that Black Mirror fiction has become a reality, but it will always seem implausible to me, even though it's already happened. And the idea that we would have, a Republican Party that is not only accepting but enthusiastically embracing a president, a former president who not only failed to commit to a peaceful transfer of power, but engineered a violent one.
Right.
It's just beyond shocking. So it's the idea that we could live in a world where Texas or California could ultimately secede, and that just not that many more dominoes have to fall to make those events seem plausible.
Right. Well, think about what we've learned about January 6th since January 6th. And, if you're there are two things, both before the 6th and after the 6th, that are particularly sobering. So before the 6th, what's incredibly sobering is that there was, as we've now learned, this incredibly comprehensive effort to overturn the results of the election that depended a great deal on if Mike Pence had just said yes, where would we have been? We would have been through the looking glass on a constitutional crisis. And all of this pressure focused on Mike Pence saying yes to this comprehensive scheme to either flip the results right there on January 6th or send them back to the states, and then creating an enormous amount of chaos. And then after Mike Pence says no, this is one thing that's incredibly sobering to me, is if you look at the approval ratings of Donald Trump and Mike Pence after January 6th, only one of the two, their approval rating plunges, and it's Mike Pence, not Donald Trump.
It's incredible.
So what that told me is that you had a Republican Party that was so fully committed to this election steal effort that even a longtime Republican who had stood by Donald Trump's side every moment of his presidency, who then appeals to his faith as an evangelical who is sort of the representative of the evangelical base in the Trump administration, appeals to his faith to do the right thing, and he's rejected by his own movement in favor of Donald Trump. And to me, in some ways, that was as sobering as all of the events that happened before, that not even the shock of the moment of January 6th could shake people from this hyper-partisanship and animosity and distrust that led them down the road of the Stop the Steal effort.
Well, I want to get to January 6th and Trump and all the attendant horrors there, but I promised to properly introduce you, which I will have done in the intro, but I think you should say something about your orientation here, because lest you be mistaken for the usual libtard who's just nodding along with my libtard blasphemy here. What is your political background?
Yeah, so I grew up a Republican. I was a Reagan Republican from way back, conservative lawyer, pro-life, religious liberty attorney, ran for a while the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, civil liberties nonprofit, defending free speech and due process and religious freedom in higher education, and then was a part of Christian conservative legal organizations, was a delegate to the 2012 Republican National Convention. So I was definitely Republican, a Romney delegate. And then in 2016, I broke with the GOP over Trump. So going all the way back to the early phase of the primary season, I could not continue to support a party that would put that person as its leader.
So did you break the moment he became the candidate?
I broke with the Republican Party the moment he became the candidate. I became never Trump, to use that phrase, or much earlier when he was a front runner. Once I began to realize who this person truly was, because like a lot of Americans, my main exposure to Donald Trump was as an entertainer, not as a politician. And then you begin to see the true dimensions of his character, or lack thereof, during the campaign. And I just realized that I could not look at myself in the mirror, much less my fellow citizens who, in the 1990s, I'm somebody who's standing and yelling character matters about Bill Clinton. I couldn't do that in 1998 and then turn around in 2016 and say, oh, well, forget all that.
Yeah, and also you're a veteran, right? You were in the Army?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I was in the Army Reserve, and I was active duty serving in the Iraq War during the surge in 2007, 2008. I was a JAG officer, Army lawyer. I served with the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment in Diyala province during the surge. Mm-hmm.
And what's the experience of a lawyer in combat? I mean, do you actually, are you just, cowering in the green zone looking at legal briefs, or are you out there risking your life in various operations that require the presence of a lawyer? What's going on there?
So it's a mix. So I was with a combat arms unit, so I was not in the green zone. So I was out in Diyala province, far, far away from the green zone in Baghdad. And my commander, my squadron commander, I thought it was an armored cavalry, was very clear. He said, you cannot make decisions that impact the lives of soldiers until you experience, in my CAV troopers, until you experience what they experience. So I was in the base a lot, and I was outside of it a lot. So I was doing detainee operations. I was doing law of armed conflict, assisting the command and making decisions, shoot, don't shoot, bomb, don't bomb. I was out doing tribal relations work. But, one of the things, if I'm going to be in an armored cavalry squadron, I have to understand what the area of operations is like. And so I was outside the wire quite a bit doing, various aspects of my job.
Mm-hmm. And I get the sense, I think you mentioned it briefly in the book, but I get the sense that your experience in Iraq has primed you for various epiphanies and concerns about the fragmentation you're witnessing in our own society. Yeah. How do you see what's happening in the U.S., I mean, it's not just the U.S., but focus at home here, through the lens of the failed state of Iraq?
Yeah, there was one specific aspect of the Iraqi civil war that really stood out to me as an alarm bell for us. And it was essentially, if you talk to Sunni or if you talk to Shia at the height of the war, the underlying divisions between them at some level seemed quite solvable. In other words, you could have a degree of religious tolerance where both Sunni and Shia could practice their faiths, which are somewhat different, but they're both Islamic faiths, but somewhat different. With full liberty, oil revenue divisions are certainly manageable. Differences in governance of each region, certainly manageable. But the thing that was truly difficult to deal with was the grievances. And when I say grievances, I mean real grievances. In other words, if you talk to a Shia militiaman and you start to explore why they've taken up arms, they're going to have a terrible story of what the Sunni have done to their family or done to their tribe, and vice versa with the Sunni telling about Shia atrocities. And what really strikes me about our divisions here is if you boil down a lot of the political disputes are subject to compromise. I mean, they're not unsolvable. I mean, even if you look at an issue like abortion, which the pro-choice and pro-life seem miles apart, but the large majority of Americans are in a more middle position. The political issues seem pretty darn solvable, but the level of animosity is what's really driving our polarization, and this story of grievance and anger. And that's what struck me in Iraq, was this constant feeling of grievance and anger that was rooted in very real things that happened. We're starting to see replicate itself here, to a lesser degree. Thankfully, it's not, we're not in a situation like Sunni and Shia were in Iraq. But if you talk to a Republican, they can tell you chapter and verse of terrible things that the left has done. If you talk to a progressive, they can tell you chapter and verse of terrible things that the right has done, and they're real things, so they're actual real outrages that are driving a lot of our division.
Yeah, I think I noticed that in, again, a somewhat more abstract way in the careers of several people I know, who an experience I share to some degree. I mean, I know many people on the left, or who are formerly on the left, who, with the eruption of wokeness, pre and post Trump, experienced something like an attempted reputational murder from their fellow liberals, right? And you send the wrong tweet, or you have the wrong position on Black Lives Matter, say, and what you meet among your former co-tribalists is nothing but contempt grading into a fully weaponized sociopathic attempt to destroy your life, right? And Twitter is the medium upon which most of this happens. And then I've noticed these people, many of whom have podcasts or they're out there spreading their views to one degree or another. I've noticed them migrate toward Trumpistan, and some of them have been fully absorbed by it. And it's clearly a psychosocial phenomenon for them. I mean, it's not like these are people who were real liberals, and it's not that the foundation of their political views has shifted. It's that they have been enrolled in a kind of psychological experiment, which, from my point of view, they failed. Right? I mean, they became intellectually dishonest to a degree that should seem impossible, in order to kind of do the emotional arithmetic on what has happened to them. They got love bombed by the right for everything they said against wokeness, and they got nothing but hate from the left, and so they just decided to just flip everything upside down in their politics and ignore all of the obvious problems with what's happening on the right, including Trump, the problems of Trump himself. But it does capture the dynamics you just described, which is, when you ask these people what the hell's going on, they have a long list of grievances, right? I mean, they have been just attacked endlessly by the left in the most dishonest ways possible, and it's that is what that explains their pilgrim's progress to the Dark Lord.
Yeah, well, and we are as human beings, we long for relationship and community, and if you have been rejected by one community, if you've been purged, if you've been subject to a storm of hatred, you're going to look for another community. It's the most natural thing in the world in a way, but at the same time, if you're longing for community and then you're going to ignore some of the real problems within that new community, you become in a sad way part of the problem. That you're just switching from one flawed partisan tribe to another flawed partisan tribe because one of them rejected you, contributes to our crisis in some important ways. Because what it does is it causes your new tribe to sort of feel validated by your presence. See, they're so bad. They're so bad, and we're much more welcoming. But if you drill down into what's happened in this country, there is not a phenomenon. If you're going to talk about cancel culture, which a lot of people think of as mainly a left-wing phenomenon, it's all over the place on the right. All over the place. And one of the things when I was researching the book that was very helpful for me, I was talking to some experts in conflict in the developing world who were beginning to refocus a lot of their efforts here in the United States because they were seeing some of the same things that cause civil strife overseas. They're seeing some of these same phenomenon here in the United States. And one of the most enlightening conversations I had was with a scholar who said, when there is a revolutionary or an extremist moment, the first target of the extremists often isn't the other side. It's the, quote, in-group moderate of their own side.
The near enemy.
Yes, the near enemy. You have to purge the near enemy or the in-group moderate to create the solidarity necessary to fight the next battle. And when you see that phenomenon, you just see it everywhere. Some of the most vicious cancel culture or canceling you'll see is left on left. It's blue on blue or red on red. In fact, it's actually pretty hard for blue to cancel red or red to cancel blue, but then you have that community that will rally to your side.
Yeah. So what was your experience? Remind me, where were you working as a journalist when you announced that you were a Never Trumper? And what was that experience like?
So I was at National Review, and this is in 2015 when I first became very strongly critical of Trump. In the early 2016, I said I was going to be Never Trump. And we faced a hellstorm from the beginning. I mean, in August 2015, I'll never forget, is when the first round of death threats came in, the first round of really horrific social media harassment, including, taking pictures of my then 7-year-old youngest daughter who's adopted, and she's adopted from Ethiopia, and photoshopping her picture into her face into gas chambers and slave pictures. Threats aimed at my wife, threats aimed at me, at my family, online harassment. All of this started happening in 2015, 2016, and it's never fully stopped. It just comes and goes.
And remind me, so the National Review, was it the editorial position of the magazine to go against Trump, or were you just an outlier within the organization?
So the magazine had a cover story called Against Trump that was against him in the primaries. So the magazine formally came out against Trump in the primaries, but then did not endorse anyone in the general election. So the editorial position of the magazine in the election was neutral. And so I had a number of colleagues who voted for Trump and a number of colleagues who did not. And National Review, because it's sort of historically been the flagship intellectual journal of the right, became the center of just an enormous amount of contention and pressure. Now, the magazine itself did a great job in sort of granting academic freedom to each one of its writers. That we were, no one told me to change my mind in leadership, that I needed to support Trump if I was going to stay at National Review. But the pressures being put on National Review were incredibly strong. And look, a lot of the guys who are my friends, my friends to this day, I'm not at National Review currently anymore, but who are my friends to this day, they were pretty darn courageous in resisting the pressure to make National Review sort of a house organ of the Trump administration, which it never was.
So, let's see, I was thinking we would save Trump until the end, but the tractor being full of his awfulness is being felt with every sentence here. Let's, we may bounce around. I mean, this is a generic problem of hyperpolarization and what you refer to in the book as negative polarization, which we described, and just, the loss of trust in our institutions, the fragmentation of media, the breakdown of civility, the upregulation of tribalism, conspiracy thinking. There's a generic problem that visits the left and the right. I think it does so with some important differences, which we might discuss. but I think we'll probably spend more time on the right, the problem of the right. I think you and I will fully agree about the problem on the left and the right, frankly. And it's interesting to consider that because, on paper, you and I, are not in the same tribe, right? I mean, you're an evangelical Christian. I'm a famous atheist. I've said some very nasty things about your faith, which is, I got to think has not warmed you up for this conversation. And yet, you and I are going to have an entirely civil conversation about all of these things. So what tribe are we in is the rhetorical question I would ask all of the people who accuse me. I don't know about you, but I'm often accused of tribalism, even though I attack the left and I attack the right, and I have positions that are not entirely predictable. For instance, you and I'm pretty sure we'll disagree about abortion, and yet we're going to agree about guns. And so it's just, tribalism does not capture the animus you and I are going to express on the various topics that will provoke our animus. And that's a good thing, because tribalism, in my view, is one of our greatest problems at this point. The idea that people feel this social pressure to conform to the sway of ascendant bad ideas, and in many cases ideas which are obviously bad, and claims which are obviously false. I guess before we lurch into Trumpistan, is there something general you can say about the different expression of this problem on the left and the right politically?
Yeah, well, and one thing, just going back to what you were saying a moment ago about our differences, I think that while we certainly have differences on a number of fronts, we're both small L liberals and both committed to American pluralism.
Yeah.
So, in other worwords, we both see a role and place, and there should be a role and a place for each of us in the American system. And the American system is supposed to exist, is supposed to provide a place where atheist and Christian can live side by side and both communities can flourish. That's sort of a hallmark of the American classical liberal system when it's functioning well. And so I've always perceived you as being quite committed to American pluralism. And this is, I think, where a lot of there's an old culture war which is over things like gun control or abortion or religious liberty. And it's being supplanted, I think, by a new culture war that is really, quite frankly, over liberalism and pluralism itself. And this is where I feel like the far right and the far left actually have a lot more in common than one might think. Woke and anti-woke have a lot in common. And the thing that they have in common is they are deeply questioning that American small L liberalism. They're deeply questioning pluralism. And, for example, the critical race theory argument, now there are elements of critical race theory that I've learned from, and I've read CRT stuff for 30 plus years since my first day of law school. But there are elements that I find to be quite troubling, including the way in which it directly confronts American small L liberalism, American classical liberalism. And you see a lot of that arising on the right as well. So while on one hand you might say, well, the left is quite different from the right because it's going to be very, very aggressive on trans rights, and the right is going to be very aggressive in combating that move. What you'll see when you scratch below the surface of both efforts is you'll see a lot of illiberalism, a lot of willingness to use the power of the state to force sort of compliance, or to force by main force to sort of defeat your opponents, not just in the marketplace of ideas, convincing other people that they're wrong, but actually using the power of the state to punish your political opponents. And that's something that I think you're actually seeing a commonality in spite of this, disguised by the different issues that they advance.
Yes. Yeah, I guess that the important asymmetry for me, and I know you've commented on this in other forums, is that when you're talking about the derangement of the left, you are talking about something that has spread like a proper social contagion and moral panic in our most elite institutions, right? So if the true decision makers don't quite believe this stuff, they are swayed sufficiently by the people who do, that you see the capitulation of the New York Times and scientific journals, Science and Nature and Lancet. You see the ACLU become the antithesis of what it used to be, to say nothing of the Southern Poverty Law Center. You see the breakdown in elite institutions in Hollywood, etc., along these lines or on these issues. And what you see on the right is not, apart from the fact that we had a sitting president of the United States who was effectively the psychological and social equivalent of Alex Jones, and his own unique danger and derangement. But when you talk about the extreme of the right, you talk about white supremacy, say, that is not, it is politically odious and it's no doubt is a reservoir of potential violence that we should worry about, but it doesn't drive culture in the same way that what's happening on the left drives culture. I guess that's it's a distinction that may ultimately not matter all that much, but it mattered to me because what's wrong with white supremacy, what's wrong with the KKK, what's wrong with someone like David Duke, it's so obvious, right? It takes absolutely no intellectual fuel to point out what's wrong with that and to disparage it and to consider it disqualifying. But when you ask, what's wrong with all of the intersectional confusion that is causing people to call for the firings of people who simply balk at any claim that there are no difference between men and women, say, right?
Right.
And that's so confusing to so many people, and it's having such a outside influence on our conversation that it's much closer to home for me. I mean, when the New York Times is reliably wrong about trans issues or jihadism or whatever the issue is, and not only wrong but dishonest, well, then you could have the most important newspaper in the world visibly destroying it. And that's different than some lunatics with AR-15s claiming they're going to take over the United States with their militia. And that's its own problem, but it's not the same kind of cultural problem.
I would agree with that with a caveat. I would agree that when you're talking about significant problems in a place like the New York Times or, say, Harvard or Yale, these are institutions that have enormous influence, not just in the United States, but globally.
Yeah.
And so if you have deep dysfunction in these institutions, the effect of that radiates far beyond the walls of the New York Times building or the far beyond Harvard Yard. But the caveat that I would say is that there is a deep dysfunction in many very, very important conservative institutions. They don't have as much purchase. Like the sort of dysfunction in evangelical Christianity doesn't have as much purchase, say, in Los Angeles or in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but it has immense amount of impact in Middle Tennessee, where I live.
Yeah.
Or dysfunctions within the broader gun culture. That doesn't have as much of an impact in LA or Boston, where there's not not so many people who own weapons. I mean, of course, the crime problems are deeply troublesome, but when there's problems with gun culture, that's quite influential where I am. And a lot of people on the right then downplay their own cultural influence by sort of saying, well, we don't really have to worry about our cultural maladies because the New York Times is so much more powerful, or Harvard is so much more powerful. But where I live, the Southern Baptist Convention is much more potent culturally than Harvard or the New York Times. And so I agree with you. I think sort of as from an objective standpoint, I would say objectively dysfunction at the New York Times or Harvard has an enormous radiating influence throughout the culture. But I would also say that a lot of people on the right just, I don't know what the right term is, they minimize or rationalize their own cultural dysfunction as somehow less important than it really is.
Yeah, well, the asymmetry that cuts the other way on the right is that on the right you have the capitulation of the Republican Party to a full-on personality cult and crazy conspiracy, right? I mean, it's basically the Republican Party is halfway to QAnon now in terms of what the kinds of things it will claim to be true about what happened in the 2020 election, what happened on January 6th, the forward-looking dangers to our democracy, that it will work to amplify. Apparently, I mean, it's virtually anything you want to say against the Democratic Party, I would probably agree with at this point, but it hasn't become anti-democratic to the degree that the Republican Party has.
To the degree where the Republican Party, many people in the Republican Party will actually scorn the idea that they should be democratic.
Yeah.
So they fall back on the idea that the United States is a republic. No, we're not a democracy, we're a republic. Well, we're a democratic republic. Our foundational governmental institutions are either elected or appointed by elected officials. I mean, even the counter-majoritarian constitution can be amended by strong majority. So the idea that, this sort of notion that Republicans are splitting hair when they reject this idea that we're a democracy. Yeah, we are a republic. Yes, our republic is a constitutional republic and has a counter-majoritarian element to it. But it's still a democracy.
So one question about Trump and the fact that he succeeded in becoming president that has just never been satisfactorily answered for me, and you seem well placed to consider it, is just how is it that evangelicals finally and so fully embraced him? I mean, like this guy was practically the Antichrist with respect to the degree to which he violated the values or the professed values of evangelical Christianity. how is it that he succeeded in getting their support to that degree? And that I mean, I have to think that in the aftermath of January 6th, you just described, where you have Mike Pence suffering a kind of reputational defenestration for his maintaining his oath to the Constitution, and Trump's reputation only rising. I got to think that was true among evangelicals as well. Mike Pence is, in my world, practically an evangelical theocrat. Right? I mean, he is every single box you need to check to be in good standing with the evangelical church, and I think he has checked. So explain what has happened there.
Okay. Well, there's one thing that I think people have really pegged, and then another thing that an underappreciated factor that people don't talk about enough. So the one that I think that people have pegged is that if you spend 20, 25, 30 years telling a community of people that it's 6 minutes to midnight on their religious liberty, that America is about to fall, that the Democrats represent an existential threat to their faith, not just to the country, but to their faith, then that's going to have a distorting effect on a community. It's going to cause them to have a constant sense of emergency, and it's going to cause them to feel as if they have to take desperate times call for desperate measures. So if you have the Flight 93 election essay where this guy named Michael Anton said, look, we have to charge the cockpit or this plane is going down. That was a message that a lot of evangelicals were ready to hear. Now, the shame of that is that it's utterly contradicted by Scripture. So, let me put on my Bible quoting hat for a minute. And the Apostle Paul wrote that God did not give us a spirit of fear, but of power. And he's not talking about political power there, but confidence in the power of God. Power, love, and of sound mind. And yet, how much did that spirit of fear drive so many evangelicals towards an unsound mind? I mean, this was the conspiracy theories and everything that you saw. So that's the thing that I think people have accurately said. That's the conventional wisdom that has a lot of truth to it. Now, here's the part that I don't think people fully understand. And this is, to me, even more troubling and more dangerous. The role of prophecy. There are quite a few sort of self-proclaimed prophets who not only declare that Trump was God, that God was going to decree that Trump was going to be president. They not only prophesied that Trump would be president, but their prophecy included this really dangerous element that was Donald Trump has a special anointing or a special divine purpose to save this country. So Donald Trump is God's man, and he's God's man for a very particular purpose.
Who are these prophets? Are these some megachurch pastors?
So these would be large Pentecostal megachurches and movements. A lot of people who are completely not household names. You would if you're on Twitter, you don't know this movement exists. You would have more consciousness of it maybe if you're on Facebook, but it's totally outside of sort of the American world. The Pentecostal world is something that the New York Times world just by and large doesn't comprehend. And so these are people who have huge platforms in religious media, and they would say, Trump is God's man to save this country. Now, what does that do? One, it creates an unfalsifiable kind of argument. I've debated people about Trump. As a Christian, I've debated, for example, a guy named Eric Metaxas, who was a reasonably well-known Christian intellectual. And it was very clear to me that he was under the influence of prophecy. Well, how do you debate that? How do you reason with somebody who's under the influence of prophecy in that way? And then the other thing is, when the prophecy is so clear that Trump is on a divine mission, then that means that resistance to Trump comes from where? Satan. Resistance from Trump is rooted in evil. And so it really created this extreme level of religious commitment to Trump and hostility towards his opponents. And I remember when there was this ridiculous Jericho march that was a couple weeks before January, in December. And I wrote in December, watch out, because the logic of this movement is going to lead towards violence. And sure enough, January 6th was the most predictable thing in the world once you saw the religious intensity of the support for Trump. And that religious intensity went way beyond hey, I'm afraid that America is going, that the Democrats are going to hurt America, and went much more towards, if you are against Trump, you are thwarting God's divine plan. And that's where you saw that level of fanaticism that you saw on January 6th.
Yeah, so get my head around that for a second.
It's a lot.
It just seems like it could, if you rewind to 2015, and this is something I legitimately didn't track, which is before Trump won the candidacy, and when you had a field of 15 or so candidates, what was evangelical and Pentecostal opinion at that point. Did the prophecies only get articulated once he was the only choice in the face of the utter sacrilege of Hillary Clinton's presidency?
Well, some were early. So, Trump gained a lot of support pretty quickly. Now, the interesting thing was the data indicates that Trump's initial support a lot of it was located in non-church going evangelicals. I know that sounds like a strange thing to say, non-church going evangelicals, but sort of the more disconnected you were, the more the disconnected you were from civic institutions, including a congregation, the more likely you were to support Trump early. But then once Trump gained the nomination, and him and Hillary, then of course the dynamic changed. And so I think you began to have a snowball effect. So there were some who were early in on Trump, but then the snowball effect locked in. And then the other thing that was really important to sort of this faith and prophecy-based mindset was the shocking victory.
Yeah.
So the fact that nobody predicted, or very few people predicted that he'd win, and he did win, sent a message to millions of Christians that this was divine intervention. And I think that was the moment where a lot of this loyalty locked in a way that a lot of people don't really appreciate it. And I saw it happen in my community, and I saw it happen with my own eyes.
Yeah, that is actually something that I've never thought about, but it resonates with me based on my own experience. I mean, it was so anomalous.
Right.
To have been so sure that he wasn't going to win, and then to have him win was such a discombobulating experience. The purely secular version of it was still something that almost seemed to cry out for some non-ordinary cause.
Right.
Yeah, it seemed like we woke up in an alternate universe, right? Like the
Right.
laws of physics have been suspended to our horror. And so, yeah, I can easily imagine that if you put on the lens of prophecy, it seems like, okay, this is the part of the movie where God makes his presence known.
Right, exactly. And that's, again, something, so my neighborhood is, there's this New York Times calculator where you can put in your address and it'll tell you sort of how thick is your bubble. My neighborhood is 85% Republican. The neighborhood I lived in 2016, we moved in 2018, was about 80 to 90%, between 80 and 90% Republican. And I watched all this happen. I watched this sort of sense of despair on election day when everyone thought that Hillary was going to win turn into a sense of, really, it's not just joy, it was sort of beyond joy. It's almost like a sense of ecstasy that Hillary didn't win. And it created this bond with Trump that is difficult to really fully explain. And I woke up the morning after, or the day after Trump's victory, and the bond between him and his base after that victory was extraordinary. And it was directly rooted in the surprise, and the surprise for a lot of people was directly rooted in divine intervention. And once that happened, you couldn't wedge some of these people away from Trump if you tried.
Well, one of the things that many of us have speculated that explains Trump's appeal to people who you would think wouldn't view him as an ally is the variable of anti-elitism, right? I mean, he is somebody, even though he, on the one hand, tries to cash in on his bona fides as a member of the elite, right? He'll occasionally reference the fact that he went to good school, he's a billionaire, etc. The main communication from him is he despises the people who despise you. He despises all of these people who went to Ivy League schools and who are doing nothing but judge you, you, the common man who's been forgotten. And he doesn't judge you because he doesn't judge himself. I mean, because he's so without shame, and so without compunction, and so without any aspiration to be better than he was yesterday, right? He what he's for is the gratification of all of his own whims and appetites, and so he's got nothing to apologize for. Oh, you caught me with a porn star? Well, go fuck yourself.
Right.
You too would want to be with a porn star, right? I mean, it's like there's just nothing. It is tennis without the net in every direction. There's no way for him to be a hypocrite because he holds himself to no standard, ethically, intellectually. I mean, he doesn't even hold himself to a logical standard. If he contradicts the thing he said 30 seconds ago, he doesn't care, and he's trained you not to care because it's all part of this kayfabe performance where it's fake and it's real because it's extra real because he's managed to get you to swallow all the fakeness, and it's just a kind of moral potlatch, right? It's like I'm going to burn everything to show you how much I don't have anything to lose. But the thing that is so compelling, again, it's all in the shape of a hypothesis for me ultimately, is that what I imagine is the thing that's so compelling is that when you embrace him as your standard bearer, what you no longer have to stomach is anyone's judgment of you. With Trump, there's a basic communication that if you're supporting him, you're right about everything, and you're right to be you're right to be endlessly aggrieved about everything. I don't know. In one of these podcasts, probably over a year ago or more, where I was kind of grappling with the Trump phenomenon, I compared him to Jesus. I think I called him Fat Jesus, right? Like he's there's a kind of expiation of all your sins when you come to Trump, because he sins more gratuitously than anyone, and it's fine, right? He's proven to you that all is forgiven. And I don't know. I mean, I realize I just vomited a bunch of my TBS on you. So you do with it what you will.
Well, let me tell you about another phenomenon that I think is underappreciated. Again, talking. No one has to explain Trump support to me. You're talking about my friends. You're talking about extended family. My immediate family agrees with me on Trump, but extended family. So this is not a hard thing for me to figure out. And one thing that is underappreciated is shame honor culture. So the South is a place that, and there are other, it's not just the South, but there are other parts of American culture that are shame honor cultures. They are extremely disrespect focused. And, Trump comes from this sort of bridge and tunnel populism that also has that shame honor kind of conception where it's very focused on people looking down on him, very focused on not getting his due. And if you once you understand sort of the prevalence of shame honor culture on the right, it begins to make sense of the entire business model of right-wing media. Why is right-wing media so grievance-focused? Why is it always focused on who's being elitist, who's being condescending? It's that shame honor instinct that's been a part of particularly Southern culture forever. And so Trump played that up just perfectly. I mean, he was your middle finger to the elite. He was your middle finger to the establishment. How dare they come after us? And just
to again to give you a dose of my incredulity here, and now I feel like I've created a time machine in this episode. We've gone back 5 years, and I'm reprocessing my disbelief. But indulge me. How did that track through a moment like his repudiation of John McCain? Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I like people who weren't captured. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, how did not all of the Southern honor-bound military culture just not erupt in just an absolute rejection of truly that it had to be a sacrilege if you're, I mean, or it was just a measure of just how unpopular McCain was for some reason.
Yeah, so McCain was seen as an elitist. McCain, in spite of his heroic military service, in spite of his many long years of captivity, he was sort of seen as the establishment Republican. He was sort of seen as the media's favorite Republican. And I will never forget, I was literally on a National Review cruise, and we would do these once or twice a year where your supporters, you go on a cruise and you have panel discussions and all of this. And so it's some of your core supporters who are on these things. And when I heard it, I was infuriated that he would say that. I was amazed at the number of people who were totally fine with it. It was their animosity for McCain and again, this is something we can get into more, but the hallmark of negative partisanship is animosity. In other words, you are for your side, not because you love its ideas, but because you have hatred or fear of the other side. And so once McCain lost in it was an unforgivable sin losing to Obama. It was an unforgivable sin that he was sort of seen as a media, the media liked him more than your normal Republican. And all of those things put him on the outside. And in reality, so when Trump went after him, he was not taking on somebody that the grassroots thought was one of our own. He was taking on a person the grassroots thought of as one of them. And understanding that and seeing that in that moment was pretty shocking to me at that time.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing here is that I've never lived in the South, so this is actually a shibboleth that you can disabuse me of, but I think of the South as having a greater commitment to civility as a bulwark against violence and social disorder. Like maybe it's a veneer, but it's an important veneer where being polite, especially, for men to be polite to one another,
right,
is recognized to be important in the South in a way that it's not recognized to be important in Brooklyn or Los Angeles. And it's not an affectation, a meaningless affectation. It is the thing that when you transgress it, you recognize it was, one of the breaks on the train that's leading toward violence, right? I mean, it's just you to come back to what you just said. It's in the context of an honor culture
Yeah.
where you recognize how important it is to be polite to people and to be basically civil, and yet Trump is the antithesis of civility, right? I mean, he's somebody
True.
who never has played by those rules at all. So I mean, again, I just don't understand the Southern embrace of his style there.
Yeah. Well, going back to sort of what it is we're talking about. So the South is a place of paradoxes. On the one hand, it's a place of a lot of civility and politeness, and people who come and visit often say, "Man, wow, people are a lot nicer here." But it is also at the same time more violent than a whole lot of other places in
Yeah.
America. So these two things are existing side by side, and the violence often occurs when the honor shame sort of matrix is broken. In other words, when a person
Yeah.
feels dishonored. And so then you're looking to punch, then you're looking to strike back. And that's what Trump was. And there's some really interesting literature about this. There's this great, fascinating book called Desire, Violence, and Divinity in Modern Southern Fiction.
Hmm.
How about that for a pull from obscure academic work? But there's this great phrase in there. It's by a Kent State professor named Gary Kubia. And he says, honor meant that Southerners beheld themselves as others beheld them. And quote, their self-worth lived in the look of the other.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
again, you see this all over, the right-wing media. How dare they disrespect you? This is how somebody can own like 6 car dealerships and feel like they're, and feel like they're not an elitist because somebody out at the New York Times looks down at them. And Trump really punched back at that. He punched back in that elitism, and he defeated the elites on behalf of and to vindicate the honor of his supporters. And again, all of these things create this kind of deep psychological bond that helps explain, why we are where we are.
Yeah, I guess as long as you remember that it was all of his norm violations were pointed in the right direction
Yes.
from the point of view of his supporters, then
Mhm.
he was just a kind of golem of impropriety that was just aimed at the elites. And as long as,
Yes.
and that was fine. I mean, that was perfect. Well, so let's talk about what is true now and what the future looks like. I mean, I must say I'm uncertain about how we should play our hand here going forward. And there are many moments where I've been uncertain about what to root for, what we should do. I mean, I guess I'll bring one up, which is top of mind. I'm still uncertain about what the media should have done around the Hunter Biden laptop scandal. Like that was a moment where it looked like a potential replay of a terrible recent history where you had the October surprise of Comey stepping before the camera saying we're looking into Hillary's emails yet again, 11 days out from the election. As I've said many times before, I do consider her loss overdetermined. She was a terrible candidate, and
Right.
that was just, you didn't need the hand of God to explain her loss in the
Right.
end. But it also was pretty clear that it was reasonable to worry that if the New York Times and CNN and everyone else had given the Hunter Biden laptop problem a fair hearing right before the election, that could have been the thing that tipped the balance into 4 more years of Trump. And so it's easy to understand the reluctance to do that. I guess, that reluctance need not have tipped into any dishonesty about what was plausible to believe at that point. But I still, honestly, I do worry that playing by the rules there of saying, okay, let's look at this, could have easily given us 4 more years of Trump when, from my point of view, it simply didn't matter. I mean, given that we had a president who was not committing to a peaceful transfer of power
Right.
at that point, it simply didn't matter what was on that laptop. I mean, literally, I would say that, Hunter Biden could have had severed heads in his basement and it wouldn't have mattered from my point of view.
Well, I agree with you. I think that, and the key there is Hunter Biden. The difference between the Hillary laptop story and the Hillary investigation is that went straight to the heart of Hillary's conduct. The Hunter Biden laptop story was a Hunter Biden story.
Although
And
I think people would say that several of those emails suggest that there's clear impropriety and grift on President Biden's side because the references to, the big dog needs to get 10% of this or whatever. Like they're again, I have not gone into the weeds on this, but it just Biden's conduct is implicated there if you've gone down that rabbit hole.
Right. I've read those emails and it's very hazy. And I think the reality is that the story actually ended up with more legs in right-wing media than it otherwise would have gotten because of the social media censorship.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, the instant that Twitter clamped down and the instant that Facebook sort of minimized its visibility, was the instant that it became days and days and days of story in right-wing media about, look at what big tech is trying to do. It's trying to put its thumb on the scales. Don't let big tech put its thumb on the scales. So my own view is that the whole big tech censorship drive at that point just flat out backfired, that it gave a lot of legs to a story that on its face was kind of just odd. You know, what Rudy Giuliani comes up with a laptop with a hard drive and through mysterious circumstances, and it's got cryptic emails, and we all know that Hunter Biden had a ton of problems and traded on his last name anyway. I mean, like, that's nothing new. But what was big in right-wing media was the Twitter blocking it. You can talk about that a lot, and you also then talk about Hunter Biden. But the idea, I've never found it particularly credible that the Hunter Biden story was going to shift opinion on Donald Trump and Biden in a material way, especially when, you know, this was, very few people didn't know what to think about Donald Trump by November 2020.
Yeah. Well, and also there's the glaring asymmetry there, which is whatever, if you take the worst possible interpretation of the Hunter Biden emails and you judge Joe Biden by that evidence, his level of corruption is like a firefly compared to the sun when you're looking over what Trump is not only obviously guilty of, but would brag about, you know, as something he's done. I mean, the guy is trailing thousands of lawsuits. You know, you just look at, you know, Trump University as a single data point. If anything like that were in Joe Biden's backstory, you know, presumably we would never hear about Joe Biden again, and yet, you know, nobody cares in Trumpistan.
Right.
So you, as you say, you have friends and family members who are Trump supporters. Is there anything that can be said to Trump supporters at this point that stands a chance of changing their view of the situation? I mean, like, I presume you're following the January 6th hearings.
Yes.
Is there any disclosure there, any possible disclosure there that would change opinion?
Well, yes, but. So the but is that there is a core in the GOP, whether it's 30%, 35%, that is absolutely unshakably Trumpian. That goes all the way back to his initial base in the primaries. But there's a large number of people who they're willing to go with somebody else. And if you're looking for, now what people I think are, they're looking for a moment of rejection of Trump.
Yeah.
And that's going to be elusive. If instead it's a moment where they move on. In other words, it's not going to be like a prodigal son moment where somebody says, I'm so sorry, I've been so wrong, let me change. I feel like it would be more like the way a lot of the Republican base moved on from Nixon. You weren't going to find a ton of Republicans who'd say, I'm so sorry for supporting Richard Nixon. They just started supporting somebody else.
Right.
And I think that that's where January 6th can come in, that some of these hearings, to the extent that they penetrate into the Republican world by saying to people, look, this guy's just got too many problems to keep supporting. If you want to defeat the Democrats, go with somebody besides Donald Trump. And that's going to be probably a more compelling argument than you need to repudiate your prior support for Trump or repudiate Trump. Just move on.
Yeah. So, but it just seems like, well, I mean, one, that would be a good thing. I mean, depending on who they're moving on with, I guess.
True.
You know, who knows how much things could degrade from here. If it's you know, President-elect Marjorie Taylor Greene or something awful. But I guess what is just as a return to sanity, I think what you want, anyone who's standing outside of Trumpistan must want, is an acknowledgement that certain things are true and certain things are untrue, right? Or certain things are plausible and certain things were never plausible. And I mean, it's a little bit like asking, you know, what would it look like for someone to come out of the QAnon cult and demonstrate that they're actually out of it, right? It's not just a matter of moving on to a new thing and never explaining what happened. I feel like you need some explanation as to why you were willing to tolerate the claim that the election was stolen and that January 6th was just a LARPing, just a LARPing of goofballs, and that nothing was ever at stake. And there has been no damage done to anything that mattered. It was all being blown out of proportion by the sheeple over at MSNBC. And it's just like, there has to be some acknowledgement of how close we came to something truly terrible.
I want that desperately. Like, I want that acknowledgement. I think that acknowledgement is absolutely critical for healing this country. I'm very pessimistic that we'll ever get it. And I think that the way people reconcile it is as they learn additional facts, they'll do what people do. They'll rationalize their prior mistakes. They'll say, why would I ever trust, why would I trust the media? The media had gotten so many things wrong. Look at what the media did to the Hunter Biden story. So I had no reason to trust the media. I had no reason to trust these institutions. So, they feel fine about their prior positions.
So for the Trump supporters in your life, are any of them following the January 6th hearings, or are they just tuning them out?
Oh, the hardcore, no. Some of the more casual, yes. Yes, they are. They're following. And, they'll just see a snippet here and a snippet there. But a lot of the more casual Trump supporters are totally ready to move on from him. Those are the people who, for example, voted for Brian Kemp in Georgia or Brad Raffensperger in Georgia over the Trump chosen candidate.
Right.
That's why you're seeing in some of these one-on-one type races, the Trump endorsement is invaluable. In the multi-candidate primaries, that Trump endorsement can still be the key.
So let's talk about some of the more generic variables here, which could lead one to be pessimistic about where all this is headed. And here the problem is larger than Trump. I mean, it's also the mirror image of extremism and negative polarization on the left. And it's variables like, maybe I'll throw some nouns at you and you can tell me, you can put the puzzle pieces down wherever you want. I mean, how do you think about the role of federalism here?
Well, I think there's a way in which federalism can be healthy and a way in which federalism can be deeply dysfunctional. So when I wrote my book, I thought one of the ways that we can diffuse this national tension is by making more important decisions at a local level where, for example, there are red states that can implement solutions for red state solutions for problems. Blue states can do their solutions and kind of de-escalate national politics. What I didn't anticipate, and this is where I wasn't quite pessimistic enough in my near-term analysis, is the way in which people would use local politics to fight national battles. So, for example, here in my community, there's a group called Moms for Liberty who went after critical race theory. But there's no critical race theory in our schools here. This is a very conservative district. So what did they do? They went after and they tried to ban the book Ruby Bridges Goes to School from the young elementary curriculum. That's not a critical race theory book. It's about Ruby Bridges desegregating schools in Louisiana. They tried, one of the things they objected to was a Norman Rockwell painting. So this is where why are they doing this? Because they want to own the libs. And they're worried about, San Francisco schools, so they're trying to draw these big firewalls around the local schools and creating huge amounts of contention and anger. And so that's a negative way that federalism works. But a more positive way is, kind of stick to your knitting and stick to, what are the issues that are salient locally instead of using your local school board election as a proxy for a national fight.
And how do you think about the role of geography here?
Yeah. Interesting. Geography is fascinating because when I write in my book about this phenomenon called the Big Sort, and this comes from a Bill Bishop book with that same name from several years ago, how Americans are moving and living around people of like mind to a degree greater than any other time since we've been measuring statistics. And what's happening as we sort like this by geography is we're actually increasing extremism because of this other phenomenon that I talk about in the book called the law of group polarization, which means when people of like mind gather, they tend to become more extreme.
Yeah, it's based on a Cass Sunstein paper?
Exactly. So this is a Cass Sunstein concept from a paper in the late 1990s, incredibly important. And once you understand that whole concept, a lot of American politics starts to make sense. Why are our academic institutions becoming so radical? Well, they're ideological monocultures, and monocultures become more radical. And so that geographic sorting is taking that reality you see in a lot of institutions of higher education or other institutions and putting it at a level that's citywide or statewide and increasing radicalization across huge geographic regions.
Yeah. And how is culture bifurcating there? I mean, it's interesting. Like you made the claim early on when I asked you about these megachurch pastors who were prophesizing that if you're on Twitter, you haven't heard of these people.
Right.
I mean, that's a fascinating phenomenon because it's very easy. As much as we pay lip service to the idea that we're all in our bubbles and we're all suffering some kind of algorithmic myopia, this was true long before Twitter.
Yeah.
As an author, you had the sacred totem of the New York Times bestseller list. But then when you would contemplate the books that were not on it for whatever reason, like a Left Behind series of novels that outsell all the books on the bestseller list, but no reader of the New York Times ever hears about them because I forget what the mechanism was there, that like Christian bookstores weren't reporting to the New York Times list or something like that. There's this parallel culture that you just don't know about. But it's, I guess, it's part of this great sort you're describing.
Yeah, absolutely. And, what's interesting is you'll have people who are pretty convinced they're deeply clued in on American culture, and then will be completely ignorant of trends, cultural trends that impact and deeply shape not just millions of people, but tens of millions of people. Again, this, going back to Pentecostal Christianity is, I think, the fastest growing religion in the world. And if not the fastest growing at scale, one of the fastest growing religions. Yet the number of people in elite spaces who even know what it is really small. And so, one of the things that, even if you're not talking about these, really consequential philosophical differences that we do have, and you just drill down to common pop culture, that's vanishing. One of the most interesting things that I saw after 2016, when a lot of people started to think about, well, wait a minute, I don't understand a big part of America if they could vote for Donald Trump, was the New York Times, the Upshot, run by Nate Cohn, put out these maps of TV viewing. And what was fascinating to me was that red and blue America were just watching different shows. Just, that's the kind of the most basic kind of common culture. Could you talk about the same TV show? And the answer is no. And that even extends into sports. College football is a very red phenomenon. NBA basketball is very blue. One of the last sort of common sports cultures is the NFL football. And it's incredibly contentious politically because, the kneeling controversies and things like that. So
I think the example you gave of the shows right and left that were most popular, it was Game of Thrones was watched on the left, and Walking Dead was watched on the right.
Yes.
But I don't know what it says about me that I watched both of those. Maybe it's just that I have too much time on my hands.
Same. That just makes us more culturally literate than the average person.
Yeah, I was doing my research. So, but we're all just by default blind to that segmentation because we don't see what we don't see, and we don't report that absence of data as a blind spot. We just notice whatever we do see. And then we're blindsided by some evidence of a trend that, like the election of Trump, that seemed to come out of nowhere. What are you thinking about now as something that is off the radar of most people who are in the elite bubble of some kind?
Ooh, that's a good question. I do think, and this is not something that's increasingly on the radar, but I think is not enough on the radar, and that is the change in American gun culture. So the change in American gun culture is, so there's always been a defiant element to American gun culture. There's sort of this saying that's been, NRA type saying that's been around forever called Molon Labe, which I believe is like Latin for come and take it. Very defiant around this whole concept of my gun rights, don't come after my gun rights. What I'm beginning to see it morphing into is that defiance, that spirit of defiance, is buttressed by guns. In other words, so where it used to be the spirit of defiance in gun culture is, don't come after my gun. It is, my gun is a bulwark against you coming after me and my political positions, my preferred policies, and one of the things that I think was incredibly dangerous was the increased prevalence, especially during the COVID era, of armed protests, where people are open carrying their AR-15s, and armed protests outside, for example, election workers' homes. And this is a shift in the gun culture away from, look, I own a gun and I own a gun for self-defense, and more towards, I own a gun and I own a gun to intimidate you. Yeah. And that watch out for that. Watch out for that.
Yeah, that was all very scary and oppressive, and it's the joke that has circulated in a variety of forms, which plays upon the ambient level of racism or imagined racism in white Southern gun culture, which is, the people's feelings about the NRA will change when, the black people arm themselves with AR-15s with the same level of abandon. But did you ever see the footage of that black militia? I forget where they were. How was that absorbed?
Georgia.
Yeah. I mean, that was an impressive show of force among, hundreds of fully weaponized black militia members. And, it was as alarming as it is in any other context. But it was, it had this perverse pleasure associated with it, which is, okay, it'd be interesting to see how the white gun-crazed people in the South absorb this new data point. What was the reaction? It's just the fondness for guns. Is that going to trump everything else, and it doesn't matter?
To the extent that people even knew about it, the gun rights movement is far too savvy to sort of so blatantly switch its position like that. So, a lot of it was, wait a minute, a keen sense of awareness that if you come out against this, then you're going to undermine everything that you've been arguing. And so it was, there were some people who expressed alarm about that, but as a general matter, which you'll see, especially amongst a lot of the more aggressive gun rights supporters, is they're going to quite openly applaud black gun owners who open carry. And they're not going to impose that double standard. And because they know, some of them is genuine, hey, look, gun rights for me means gun rights for thee. And some of it is just pure political, a pure degree of political savvy that says, look, I know I'll really undermine my position if I'm so blatant, if I impose such a blatant double standard.
Yeah. I don't know if you've heard any of my rap about guns, but I think I heard you on at least one podcast in the aftermath of Uvalde, so we basically agree, I think. But it's just a very hard issue, among many other hard issues, to parse in ways that don't discombobulate everybody. Yeah. But it's also one of these issues where it's very hard to see any basis for progress because it's so. You just take the understandable alarm on the left around, just our outlier status on the world stage, and it's crazy the level of, it's crazy the price we pay for all of our guns on a yearly basis, from murders to mass murders to suicides. And the idea that there's nothing we can do about that seems preposterous, right? And yet you literally need only give people on the left, whether it's or elitists from center left to left, 2 or 3 sentences on the topic before they put both feet in their mouth, before they get everything wrong about ballistics it's just like they will mispronounce the name of every gun manufacturer more complicated than Colt. It's just unbelievable. They talk about, semi-automatics being designed to kill people as fast as possible, and then it becomes clear that they think semi-automatics and fully automatics are the same thing.
Yeah.
And this happens to this will happen on Meet the Press or on CNN or it's just and the price they pay. I'm not sure. Maybe the conversation can't even be had, so they're not actually paying a price in loss of credibility because no one's listening to them on the other side of the argument. But in my world, it's just it is just one malapropism after another, and so it's very easy to see. I consider myself quite outside of gun culture. Perhaps unlike you, maybe this is one difference between us because I don't live in a red state. But as connected as I am to the reasons to own firearms, and as much as I've trained with them, most of what's in my brain is a repudiation of gun culture for all the reasons that would be familiar and comforting to people on the left. And I have no religious attachment to the Second Amendment, and yet I have a very pragmatic attachment to the freedom to own a firearm, given my perception of just the realities of human violence and the fact that calling 911 is not, in fact, a means of self-defense in any American city, now or in the future. And so it's just, again, that's just me whinging about the current state of the matter. But I don't see how we make progress on that problem and several others that currently divide our society.
Well, you raise a really good point, and that is, if gun rights supporters tend to know guns, they tend to know different, they know a lot about guns, and you'll have these spasms of public conversation where people will be advocating for gun control, or they'll be talking about certain kinds of guns, and it's very clear very quickly they don't know what they're talking about. And it's hard to sort of explain to people how unpersuasive that is.
Yeah, or the claim that no one ever successfully defends themselves with a gun.
Right.
That is an article of faith almost universally subscribed on the left. That this is the idea that the answer to a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. That is basically borne out so infrequently that it's just a laugh line, right? Like that just doesn't happen. And you just need only look for videos on YouTube. There's an endless number of videos on YouTube where you can just see a good guy, or at least a bystander with a gun, solving the problem that would have been solved no other way.
Right. And that's evidence at the media level, because I can think off the top of my head of situation after situation where somebody stopped even mass shootings, or somebody, people with handguns stopped people with AR-15s. These are things that happen. And when I talk about guns, I speak in a lot of places that are very deep blue and very much opposed to gun rights overall. And I just tell my family story, and I talk about the number of times that we've been doxxed, for example, by white nationalists, and the threats that we faced. And I said, what's your recommendation for how I should protect my family? And keep in mind, I don't have the resources for 24/7 security. And if I did have the resources for 24/7 security, what do you think they'd be carrying?
Right, exactly. Yeah.
And it really does actually, when you enter into the conversation, sort of being transparent like that and just say, look, this is a reality that I face. What do you have to say to me? It actually kind of diffuses a lot of the intensity because it makes it much more concrete. And I'm a human being in front of them, and then, facing a threat from people that they realize are threatening. They're not going to say that we should not pay attention to white nationalists. They would never say that.
Mm-hmm.
And so it really does humanize the conversation, I found. And then you can just sort of start to walk people through the decision-making process and their reasoning. And I've been really surprised, actually, at the level of honest and real and conversation and flexibility that people will have when you kind of go back to the beginning and walk people through the self-defense decision-making process.
Yeah. I realize we're kind of going off on a tangent here, but it's interesting because ethically, it is a real conundrum for me because I do get the outside view of our predicament, which is we look like we're a society that has completely lost its mind, right? It's like if you look at us from England or Australia, what are you? This attachment to guns is causing just reliably year after year tens of thousands of unnecessary deaths, and just as bad, these spectacularly awful episodes, which again are just a rounding error on the actual problem, but they're just so awful. These mass shootings in schools that it's society straining nonetheless, and the problem is just so obviously that you have all these guns in circulation, right? So get rid of the guns, and you'll be Japan, and you won't have this problem. And I'm sympathetic with that. Like if we could just start from scratch, it would be tempting to say, okay, let's not do that Second Amendment thing this time, and just have a gun-free zone. But that is also a world in which, as I've argued previously, the youngest, most aggressive, largest man basically always wins, right? So if the lunatic at your door is bigger and stronger and younger than you are, you've got a problem you actually can't solve, right? And again, when he's in your living room, calling the cops is not a solution.
Yeah, right.
So that's an ethical conundrum for which a gun is actually the answer, right? I mean, it is to call it, this is NRA pablum, but it is called an equalizer appropriately because it's the only thing currently, barring some invention of a super taser or something that functions like a gun, albeit non-lethally. It is the only thing that that takes a violent contest, it puts it at range, and it takes it out of the domain of athleticism and size and strength, that will be decisive.
That's exactly right. The way I put it to people is, I have a right of self-defense. A human being, just as a human being, has a right of self-defense. And very few people will disagree with that statement. They will not disagree that you as a human being have a right of self-defense. But if I have a right of self-defense sort of in the abstract, if I don't have the legal means of obtaining effective self-defense, then that right is kind of meaningless. And so in a world where in a nation where there are 400 million guns, there are 400 million guns in this country. What is the foreseeable threat that I will face? It might be a person with a baseball bat, it might be a person with a stick. But when it comes to a deadly threat, the foreseeable threat that I will face is a person with a gun. And so this idea that if I'm going to have an effective right of self-defense, then I have to have that equalizer.
But even again, that side of it is totally understandable, and I agree with it. But it's the other side of it that I find even more compelling, which is, in a world without guns, what does the problem of human violence look like? Well, it doesn't have the same scale, and that's important, but it does have a character that I find especially abhorrent, which is the big maniac always wins, right? Or virtually always wins, barring, some, miracle of training and good luck, where you have, a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, actually solves the problem for you. What you have is, you can again, these are, you need only see one video like this to have your ethical hardware recalibrated. There's a video I saw a few years ago of a home invasion where you just see, for whatever reason, this woman had like a nanny cam running in her living room, which captured her home invasion. And you just see a guy come in and a 230-pound man come in and just beat a woman senseless in her living room. And So if you don't think someone should be able to own a gun, you have to be able to say that woman shouldn't be able to own a gun, right? And watching that video, there's nobody who on earth who I would more want to hand a gun to than that woman in that situation when she had
Hmm.
the time to arm herself as a guy is kicking in her front door. And that's the in my view, that's the most compelling argument for gun ownership. And unless you're going to make moral contact with that from the left, from the gun control, gun safety side of the argument, you're not having the conversation that people on the right or on the gun owning side would require that you have to even dignify your argument with a hearing.
Yeah. So, one of the issues that we have, I think, is that there are other countries that have far higher homicide rates with far lower rates of gun ownership. So it's not just that guns are saturating the country. We have the highest rate of gun ownership in the world and far from the highest rate of homicide.
I guess the comparison is to other first world, highly developed democracies, right? Like, Western Europe.
Yeah.
If we compare ourselves to Latin America, all of a sudden we look pretty good.
Yeah, true. Now, the interesting thing, though, Sam, this is something that's been interesting to me for a while is Europe the better comparator to the US versus other parts of the world? We often compare ourselves to Europe for obvious reasons. I mean, we're an Anglosphere country. The initial wave of settlement came from Europe by and large. We have an advanced economy like Europe does, but we're really different from Europe in other ways. For example, religion. I mean, Europe is a much less religious place than the United States. We're far more like Latin America when it comes to religion, for example. So I think we're this kind of hybrid. When we talk about American exceptionalism, that's not saying, yay, America's the greatest and best. It's quite literally saying we're different. And I think that we're quite different from much of the rest of the world in some material respects. And we're a hybrid culture in a lot of ways. I think we have some much more Latin American, say, cultural elements and some European cultural elements. And I think the comparison of, say, the United States to Britain or Germany or France on the violence part, much less, say, the religion part, is not necessarily, it's not necessarily apt.
Yeah, I also, we spoke about honor culture, particularly in the South before, and we certainly have much more of that than most advanced first world democracies.
Right. And this is something that gets to a lot of the immigration fights. And there was this controversy a couple of years ago when a Penn professor named Amy Wax, Penn law professor, talked about how it would be better for America culturally, and sort of she was for more immigration from Europe, because saying that was closer culturally to America, sort of saying, no, it's not a racial analysis, it's a cultural analysis. And my response to that was, is that really true? Because Europe is a lot more secular than the US. If you're getting immigration from Africa or from Latin America, you're actually getting people who are more religiously similar to much of America than you are from Europe. And again, this just sort of goes to this unique American culture that we have that doesn't have a one-to-one comparison anywhere else.
Maybe she wants to import more peaceful, secular people and not so many violent religious people.
Could be.
Okay, well, so we just had a significant sidebar on guns. I think we generally agree that it's an interesting and consequential ethical problem to sort out. And I think I've gone on at great length elsewhere about my views here, which are just from a political partisan point of view, highly non-standard. I'm both a defender of gun rights, and also I think it should be far more difficult to get a gun, and I think it should be the shorthand version of this for me is that I think it should be like getting a pilot's license, right? Like you really should have to get some training and vetting, and you shouldn't be able to walk into a Walmart and walk out with an AR-15. But I think we have other topics to put to bed here, and one is because we're talking during the week where these January 6th hearings are proceeding, and it's really magnifying my sense of American division, because I have a sense that the people who should be watching these hearings certainly aren't, and I worry that we're just playing to an echo chamber for the gratification of people who already understand that Trump posed a kind of existential threat to our democracy, and I know how that sentence will bounce off the ears of fully half of America as a ridiculous overstatement of the facts. Going forward, what is your view of the situation? I mean, do you think prosecuting Trump is in the cards? Is that what you would hope for on the basis of what we've seen so far, or is that really a liberal pipe dream?
I'm actually of the view that prosecuting Trump is a viable path, but not in the way that most people are thinking of it. Most people are thinking of prosecuting Trump through the prism of January 6th. I think the best evidence of Trump's criminality is actually coming through Georgia. And this is where, there's tape recording of Trump saying, essentially saying to the Georgia Secretary of State that this could go very bad. You need to find these votes for me. And by the way, it can go very bad for you if you don't. And this is something, let's put it like this. If you're a small town sheriff and you're running for an election and you're trailing, say, by 50 votes, and you go to the county election commissioner and you say, I need 55 votes, or you might find yourself arrested. That would be illegal. Like that, that makes it, it's quite blunt. It's quite clear that would be illegal under both federal and state law, because you're trying to solicit election fraud. And what Trump did was fundamentally that. He says, hey, I need 12,000 votes, and look, I'm going to raise the possibility you could be prosecuted if we don't find those votes. And the thing that's different about Georgia from the January 6th situation is that there's actually federal case law under a federal statute called the Conspiracy Against Rights, which I believe is 18 U.S.C. Section 241, that talks about, and the case law around this statute says, hey, it's unlawful to try to expand the number of votes beyond the lawful number. It's lawful to try to limit the number of votes below the number that was actually lawfully cast. There's actually case law, especially at sort of local election levels, that's directly relevant here. And so you've got a Fulton County grand jury that is looking at this issue from a Georgia state law position. And Georgia state law is, again, pretty darn clear. And there's actually been a very comprehensive legal analysis of Trump's actions in Georgia that I think crosses the threshold for prosecution. And that's a little bit different from the January 6th scenario. It's less lurid. There wasn't any big riot, but I don't think there's evidence that crosses the threshold for prosecution that Trump actually incited the riot in the way that the law prohibits incitement. The Georgia situation, I think, is a much more viable prosecution. And I tend to be of the view that as difficult and terrible a precedent it is to indict a former president, a worse precedent is saying that just the status of making you a president or a former president puts you above the law. I think we can't have that.
Yeah. What are your expectations going forward politically into 2024? I mean, do you think he will run? Could you imagine who the Democrats are going to run? I mean, it just seems to me that whether or not Trump runs, it's wise to worry at this point that both the president and the vice president are fatally flawed candidates, whoever the Republicans put forward. And there might not be the mechanism in the Democratic Party to recognize that both are fatally flawed. And even if Biden decides to bow out, I'm not seeing how the Democrats have a come to Jesus moment with Kamala Harris and say, listen, you are unelectable, and we're putting forward Oprah or somebody else in your stead. How does all this work? How do we not wind up with a second Trump term should he run?
Boy, this is a tough question. Interestingly enough, I tend to think that the actual overhang possibility of criminal prosecution could lead Trump to declare sooner rather than later, in part to create an additional hurdle for prosecution, to sort of say, you don't want to prosecute the Republican front runner for the presidency. I mean, that would be a norms violation. You don't want to do that. So I kind of feel that there's a possibility, and Maggie Haberman has reported this, that there's serious consideration of Trump announcing relatively soon. But at the same time, there's evidence that Trump's grip is slipping. There was a University of New Hampshire poll just released saying that Trump now is trailing DeSantis in New Hampshire, which is a major change from just a few months ago. And so there's evidence. And then, of course, the Georgia primary, where Trump's chosen candidates just got walloped by the Georgia establishment candidates, Brad Raffensperger and Brian Kemp. But at the same time, it's all mixed. Dr. Oz squeaked out a win in Pennsylvania. He never would have won without Trump's endorsement. And same with J.D. Vance in Ohio. So it's mixed. But the bottom line is Trump is no longer the single most dominant figure in GOP politics. It's up for grabs more than it used to be. And my own thought is that the longer he waits to jump in, the longer he goes with this sort of ambiguity, the more his hold slips. As far as the Democrats go, I personally consider, I don't have any inside information on this, but I tend to consider that it's unlikely that Biden will run again. But there's no way he's making an announcement like that until the absolute last moment, because the instant he says he's not running is the instant he's a lame duck. Right. And I know for a fact amongst Democratic strategists that there's a real hesitance to put Kamala Harris forward for the nomination.
Yeah.
At the same time, there's a sort of sense of confusion as to who it would be if it's not her.
Yeah, and obviously the allegation would be that if she were passed over, the allegation would be it's because she's a woman or because she's black or both.
That would be the Twitter. Yeah, that'll be what Twitter says.
And that does strike me as patently false, because if you imagine a different candidate in the same mold, someone like Michelle Obama, I would predict a very different outcome. I mean, Michelle Obama seems, who knows how she would survive the actual process of campaigning, but on the face of it, she seems eminently electable, whereas Kamala Harris doesn't. So I think the variables of sex and race are not at all the problem with Kamala Harris.
Gavin Newsom seems to be positioning himself. I don't know. You can tell me more about what you think about him than I can say, but he seems to be positioning himself. I personally, from a conservative standpoint, I find the governor of Colorado, Jared Polis, more interesting. He's somebody who has taken a more libertarian approach to governance than many other Democrats. So, he's in a more moderate position, which I think is a sweet spot for Democrats. The most interesting pre-election analysis of the Democratic electorate came from Nate Cohn in 2019, when he analyzed the difference between the online Democrats and the offline Democrats. Online Democrats tended to be whiter, more highly educated, and more progressive, and they were 1/3 of the party. And the 2/3 of the party was more diverse and more moderate. And that's where the bulk of the Democratic electorate is, not the bulk of the activist class or the philanthropy class, but the actual voters tend to be more moderate and more diverse. And who can appeal to that 2/3 is going to be a real question. And Kamala Harris did not appeal to that 2/3 in 2020.
Yeah. How do you view the problem of communication and cooperation at this point? Variables like free speech and the suppression of misinformation and conspiracy thinking, the Overton window. I mean, just the quality of our conversation with one another, online and off, and what that portends for the future. What are your thoughts on the current state, and what are your thoughts on what we should do about it to improve it?
At the risk of oversimplifying, I'm going to say offline America has got to save online America from itself. There's a lot of data, and I think I've mentioned this before in the conversation, that the more online you are, the more wrong you are about your political opinions. And you think they're more hateful than they are, you think they're more extreme than they are. And quite literally, this Twitter conversation is taking this activist class of Americans and turning them against each other at a scale that's extremely dangerous and troubling, because this activist class also happens to be the people who spend all their time thinking and working in politics, whereas this very large number of Americans, what the More in Common Project calls the exhausted majority, has largely disconnected. And the problem you have is, the good news is you have a majority of Americans who want to see a way through this. The bad news is the word exhausted, that they're the ones who are checked out. But when they do check in, they can make a major difference. A prime example of this is the recalls in San Francisco, where you had these hardcore progressive school board members, hardcore progressive prosecutor, and it was progressives who got rid of them. That was not a Fox News revolt in San Francisco. This was normal, everyday, average progressive Americans saying that's too radical. And that you saw that a little bit in the Georgia primary, where normal, average, everyday Republicans said, no, this MAGA obsession with 2020 is not a reason to get rid of a sitting governor who's done a solid job. So you are seeing some revolt to the normals, but on a day-to-day basis, we're still in a position where the activist class is ripping each other to shreds online.
Yeah. How worried are you that Trumpism is a durable mania beyond Trump himself? So, let's say Trump decides not to run in 2024, and it's DeSantis or someone else who has carried abundant water for Trump all this time. When you think of someone like DeSantis, do you worry that the same norm-violating, anti-democratic genius is at work in him as a result of his the alliance and sunk cost with Trump? Or do you think that once we inherit a different batch of figureheads, we're going to default to a more normal politics?
So I'm very worried about. So I don't think Trumpism is something that is specifically. I mean, certainly the ambition of Trump, the man. Trumpism at its core is Trump's personal ambition. It's not really an ideology, but he's surfing on a wave of populist reactionary anger that existed before him and will exist after him. And the interesting question to me, though, is here's the dynamic. And a lot of times I think that we underestimate sort of the psychological and practical dynamics of political races. In this sense, I think there's a very different world where DeSantis takes on Trump versus a world where Trump steps aside and DeSantis tries to inherit Trump's base.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And so if DeSantis is trying to beat Trump, he's going to have to run as a counter to Trump's base is going to be with him, but Trump's base is what, 35% of the party. So DeSantis is going to have to appeal to people who are not Trump's base to win. That's going to totally change the dynamic of the race.
Although isn't I think the last stat I saw here was that I think it was 62% of Republicans believe the so-called big lie that the 2020 election was stolen. So isn't that his base?
So that's an interesting number because there's gradations of belief. So there's a difference between somebody who is receiving a poll question and thinks, well, wasn't there something funny going on with absentees in Pennsylvania? I just don't feel comfortable with this whole thing versus, hey, I just watched 2,000 Mules, and this thing was rotten to the core. And that's why I keep pointing back to the Georgia primary. In the Georgia primary, Trump drew the line in the sand and he said the litmus test here is, what do you think about the 2020 election? And the folks that Trump put forward were walloped. So there's a category of Republican who has disquiet about 2020 but doesn't want to keep relitigating it. And I think there's a category of Republican who has disquiet about 2020 and is obsessed with it. And that's the core of the Trump base. And the DeSantis or a Pence or a Cotton or anyone else who would take on Trump is not going to pull the people who are dyed-in-the-wool 2020 conspiracy theorists. They're going to be getting the person who they might have some questions, but they're focused on 2024 and going forward and not focused on relitigating 2020. And that will drive Trump nuts. That will drive him nuts.
Yeah, that'll be fun to watch. I'm hoping for that. Well, David, it's great to get you on the podcast finally, and I hope we can do it again once we have some more things on this part of the map to talk about. No doubt it's going to be an exciting and likely dispiriting campaign cycle as it ramps up. I'm sure the midterms are going to be a wasteland for Democrats, but as I hear myself speaking these sentences, I'm now feeling my mood plummet because the truth is, the fact that we have to pay really any significant attention at all to politics is just a totally odious opportunity cost, right? The sign of a society working is how little time people have to spend sweating politics. Yeah. And we're just not in that world. So anyway, I hope that you will help guide me through the changes to come when they arrive.
Yeah, you said that very well. The more salient politics is to your life, the less healthy the culture is. I think it's a pretty good basic formula. And especially when you overlay that with the incredible distrust in institutions even outside of politics, it means more people are turning to politics to try to control institutions, and that's incredibly dangerous.
So before we go, tell people where they can find your current work. I know you're at the Dispatch, and maybe tell me what you're turning your attention to next. Do you have another book you're working on, or what's taking up your time?
Yeah, no book is in the cards quite yet, but I write for the Dispatch twice weekly, and I write for the Atlantic once weekly. I have a newsletter from the Atlantic as well, and if you want to sort of see what I'm writing about, I'm always posting it. Here I said, we need to save America from the online people, but I'm always posting what I'm working on online, so you can follow me on Twitter at David A. French.
Great. Well, thank you, David.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been an honor.
Hey everyone, I'm Ryan Reeve Morales, lead producer of Gameplay on League. You might remember me from all those champion roadmaps, but today, for reasons I can't even fathom, they put me in front of a camera again to talk about all of League this time. So buckle up as I dive into some of the champions we have in development. After that, I'm going to pass the metaphorical mic over to Riot Froxon, who is going to talk to you about the recent durability update, as well as our plans for pre-season. So before we get into the new champions coming out this year, look back at the champions we've released in 2020. First we had the speedy ADC Zeri, then the girl boss Renata Glass. After that, the Void Empress herself, Belva. And then most recently, the Joyful Mistress. And just around the corner, we have the Udyr VGU, complete with a dad bod worthy of the Freljordian gods. Udyr's development has been a long journey, especially since he's been the first VGU that we've done that's had an ultimate skin. We appreciate you all being patient with us on this one, and hopefully the wait has been worth it. So in addition to the new champions we've released this year, we've also been shipping a lot of mid-scope updates to various champions, including Janna, Ahri, Swain, Talia, Olaf, and recently Sivir. Because we slowed down the release of new champions, we've had a bit more time to ship smaller updates to champions that are all behind the pack. So the goal of mid-scope updates isn't to reimagine a champion's visuals, theme, or gameplay. That's reserved for VGUs. Instead, we want to freshen up champions that aren't living up to the expectations of the players. We try to strengthen their finishes more, rather than reinvent it. So for Swain, we put expansive, unplayable frontline made to the max. And for Ahri, we focus on her fantasy of a mobile, rather than the assassin she had become. We saw really great responses to these projects, as well as healthy play rate spikes after their release. Given all of this, we want to keep pursuing mid-scope updates, and we already have a few champions we're exploring, including Miko and Syndra. So now let's talk about some projects I've been super excited to share with you. So later this year, we have a new top lane tank hailing from Shurima, who I briefly mentioned in the last champion roadmap. This new champion will introduce a part of Shurima that we haven't explored yet, the city of Nezuma. Now Azuma is an oasis city-state in the southern outskirts of the desert, and unlike the rest of Shurima, they don't bow to Azir. Situated on one of the only water sources for miles, the people of Nezuma had to compete with giant monsters just trying to stay hydrated. It was a hard-fought struggle, but they eventually claimed the oasis as their own and built their society around it. Now, 500 years later, this new champion leads the warriors of Nezuma to hunt those same monsters, using the rare resources they gained to build their infrastructure and weapons. He actually fought one of the largest monsters the desert has ever known, creating his unique N-Tofos out of its rare regenerating hide. N-Tofos are huge, blunt weapons that can be used defensively, but at any moment, he can shatter them, revealing carefully crafted blades, capable of tearing through any foe in seconds. Soon after, the hide will regenerate back to its blunt form, so he can, bludgeon the crap out of you. It's honestly quite impressive to see. But you don't have to take my word for it. The entire city-state is basically permanently impressed by him. I mean, he's Kasanti, the pride of Nezuma. You don't get that title for nothing. So after Kasanti, we will be releasing the highly anticipated Aurelian Soul CGU. To remind everybody, a CGU, or Comprehensive Gameplay Update, is a new type of update we are testing out on Aurelian Soul. So the goal is to completely reimagine A-Soul's gameplay without changing his visuals or narrative at all. Since let's be honest, those aspects of Aurelian Soul are still amazing, even by today's standards. But I know what you're thinking. Less talking, Mr. Reeve, more action. And by action, we mean videos. Okay, fine. Twist my arm a little bit more. Now keep in mind, the visuals are still a work in progress. One of the goals was to enhance his dragon theme. And what do dragons do? Well, they breathe fire, of course. A-Soul's new Q allows